The scream did not come from the battlefield. It came from behind the walls, from chambers where silk curtains still swayed and silver cups had not yet cooled from the last feast. That was how the noblewomen of the north learned the truth too late. When the Vikings conquered a land, death was often the mercy they were denied. The longships arrived before dawn, cutting through the mist like blades through skin. By the time the watch horns sounded, the harbor was already burning. Men rushed to arm themselves, believing, as men always did, that the war would be decided by swords and shields. They did not yet understand that the fate of their daughters, wives, and queens had already been sealed. In the high hall of Earl Ethelred's estate, Lady Elswith stood at the narrow window, her fingers trembling against the cold stone. She was born to rule land, not to flee it. Her lineage traced back generations, her dowry had been sung about by poets, and her marriage had been forged to bind alliances. She had lived her life as something precious, something protected. But as the first screams rose from the village below, she realized how fragile that protection truly was. The Vikings did not storm castles the way legends later claimed. They waited. They burned the outer settlements, slaughtered the guards who rushed out too fast, and let fear rot the courage of those still hiding behind walls. Smoke crawled into every chamber. Children cried. Priests prayed louder than reason allowed. And the noblewomen were gathered together, not to escape, but to be counted. They always counted them. When the gates finally fell, the warriors did not rush for gold first. They went for the women with fine clothing, clean hands, and eyes trained to look downward. They knew value when they saw it. Noble blood carried a different weight in Viking eyes, not honor, but opportunity. Elswith was dragged from the hall by her hair, her circlet torn away and crushed under a boot. Around her, other women were pulled into the courtyard, a young bride still wearing her wedding braid, an elderly lady clutching a rosary, twin sisters barely old enough to understand why their world was ending. They were lined up as cattle, examined not with cruelty at first, but calculation. The men of the household lay dead nearby. Fathers, husbands, brothers, bodies cooling in the mud. The women were forced to look. Not out of malice, but instruction. This was the past being severed. The Vikings spoke among themselves, laughing, arguing, deciding who would claim what. Some women were struck when they cried too loudly. Others were silenced by the simple promise whispered in their ear, survive, and you may live. Resist, and you will join the dead. That was the lie. Elswith was bound and marched toward the shore. Her feet bled on the stones. She kept her head high at first, refusing to beg. But pride does not survive long in chains. Along the path, she saw smoke rising from neighboring estates, each plume a story ending the same way. The noblewomen of the land were being gathered like spoils of war, stripped not just of freedom, but of identity. At the ships, the separation began. Younger women were pulled aside. Older ones were assessed with colder eyes. Some were deemed worthless and killed without ceremony. Others were shoved aboard the ships, thrown into the dark holds where the smell of seawater mixed with terror. The voyage across the sea was worse than the capture. Days blurred into nights. Food was scarce. Water scarcer. Women were forced to huddle together for warmth, their chains biting into their skin as the ship rocked violently. Some prayed. Some went silent. Some lost their minds entirely, screaming until they were beaten into quiet. Elswith learned quickly that memory itself became a form of pain. Remembering silk sheets, warm baths, music in the hall, these thoughts burned more fiercely than hunger. So she forced herself to forget. She focused only on breathing. On surviving each wave. When they reached the Viking settlement, the women were dragged out and lined up again, thinner now, weaker, eyes dulled. The men of the village gathered as if for a market. This was not a metaphor. It was a market. Noble birth did not protect a woman here. It increased her price. Elswith was sold to a man who spoke her language poorly but smiled too often. She was given a new name, one she did not recognize. Her old one was beaten out of her the first time she refused to answer to it. Her fine clothing was stripped away and replaced with rough wool. Her hands, once soft, cracked and bled within weeks. She learned the rhythms of servitude, rise before dawn, work until exhaustion, sleep only when permitted. She learned that obedience was rewarded with survival, and defiance with pain. She learned that hope was dangerous. Months passed. Or years. Time dissolved into repetition. Noblewomen who once commanded households now scrubbed floors. Women who had read Latin texts now counted sheep. Some were forced into unions they could not refuse, bearing children who would never know their true heritage. Ellsworth watched other captured women fade away. Some died of illness. Some walked into the sea at night and did not return. Some became unrecognizable, their eyes empty, their voices flat. She survived by becoming invisible. Yet survival itself was a kind of death. And that was only the beginning. The child did not know her real name. That was how Ellsworth understood that nothing of her old life remained. He called her mother, but he did not know where she came from or what she had been. To him, she was simply a woman in a longhouse, a quiet figure who worked and endured. He spoke the Viking tongue. He laughed like his father. And when he asked questions about the past, Ellsworth gave him none. Because how do you explain a world that no longer exists? Years after the conquest, the land that had once belonged to her family was spoken of only in fragments, distorted by rumor and song. The Vikings told stories of brave battles and glorious victories. They never spoke of the women except as prizes, wives, or servants. History, Ellsworth learned, is written by those who return home with weapons, not by those who survive without them. The noblewomen who remained alive learned to adapt or disappear. Some found power in subtle ways, mastering language, influencing households quietly, guiding children who would one day lead. Others hardened themselves into stone, refusing attachment as the only remaining form of control. But many never recovered. There were nights when screams echoed from nearby dwellings, reminders that conquest did not end with the battle. Violence became normalized, routine, inherited. The women learned to measure danger in footsteps, in tone, in silence. Fear became a second skin. Ellsworth aged quickly. Her reflection in water startled her sometimes. The girl who had once worn jewels had vanished, replaced by a woman with lined skin and guarded eyes. She no longer dreamed of rescue. She no longer believed in mercy. She believed only in endurance. Occasionally, traders arrived from distant lands, and with them, news. Christian kingdoms rising. Viking raids reaching farther south. New conquests. New women taken. Each story confirmed what Ellsworth already knew: her suffering was not unique. It was systemic. It was deliberate. The noblewomen of conquered lands were not merely collateral damage. They were resources. Labor. Symbols of dominance. Their humiliation was part of the victory. Some women attempted escape. Few succeeded. Those who were caught were made examples of. Others were traded again and again, passed between households like objects, their pasts erased piece by piece. Ellsworth watched one woman, a former countess, lose the ability to speak altogether. Another, once known for her singing, cut her own throat during a winter storm. The snow hid the blood until morning. And still, life continued. Children were born. Feasts were held. Songs were sung about heroic ancestors. The suffering of the conquered women was absorbed into the background, an unspoken foundation upon which new societies were built. In old age, Ellsworth found herself telling stories after all, but not of her own life. She told myths. Legends. Tales of queens who outwitted kings, of women who transformed into birds and flew away. These stories were safe. They carried truth without confession. When she finally died, there was no marker to honor who she had been. No record of her lineage. No acknowledgement of what was taken from her. To the world, she was simply another woman who lived and died in a Viking settlement. But the horror she endured did not die with her. It lived on in the silence of history, in the gaps between heroic sagas, in the forgotten voices of noblewomen whose suffering was deemed unworthy of record. Their fate was worse than death not because they perished, but because they were forced to live, to adapt, to survive in a world built upon their loss. And that, more than any battlefield slaughter, was the true cost of Viking conquest.